Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Probably everybody, regardless of their religious background, has an idea that God's grace or God's blessing or God's giving is dependent on something. I think every religion virtually makes the receiving of God's benefits dependent on something or other. Sometimes depending on our obedience to the Ten Commandments, or depending on our obedience to church rules, or depending on our attendance at church, or attending a communion, or attending a religious service of some kind. Or fasting, or sacrificing, or tithing, or being grateful, or having faith. Yes, that's one of the tricks too. Making God's grace dependent on having faith. But now, just as an important part of our work is releasing God in the sense of realizing that we don't need God for anything except for God to be God, which God always is. In other words, we learn to stop looking to God to do something in this moment or in the future, since whatever God has been doing is from everlasting to everlasting and never changes. Therefore, we understand that God could never inaugurate something now. In other words, He couldn't heal us now. He couldn't heal us tomorrow. We come to this through many steps in the infinite way. Firstly, realizing that God is not a withholding God. Therefore, if God isn't a withholding God, God cannot be a giving God, because giving now would imply withholding up to now. So therefore, in God, there is no such thing as giving or withholding. There is only God being God. But God is being God eternally. God has been God eternally. So that our function is really not to reach out to God as if we wanted something of God, but rather we tune in as if we ourselves had been disconnected, and we are now reconnecting ourselves with God. Then, taking another step forward, you can see that if God is responsible for the sunrise and the sunset, that these are not dependent on anything that man does or does not do. If God is responsible for the laws of nature, they are operating regardless of whether man does anything to deserve it or be worthy of it or not. In other words, what God is, regardless of man. And that is why at least one mystic of old had the wisdom to see that God's rain falls on the just and on the unjust. That there is no such thing as God's blessings being withheld for any reason or for any purpose, or certainly not because of anything we do or do not do. This, of course, makes it clear that where there is an absence of God's grace, it has nothing to do with God, it has to do with our violation of some spiritual law or some acceptance of a sense of separation from God, but never in any wise because of God, always because of our own lack in one way or another. In other words, not even because of that lack is God withholding something. Now, it takes a while to believe and to be able to come into the consciousness that can accept this truth, that the grace of God is not dependent upon anything that man does or does not do, but that man's demonstration of God's grace is dependent on his coming into conscious oneness or at one-ment with God. Let us illustrate that. We'll take the subject of supply. Now, supply is infinite. And you may think that that is a metaphysical cliche. But it isn't. That's an absolute truth. You need only count the blades of grass or the leaves on a tree or the amount of fruit on a tree or the amount of birds in the air or the amount of fish in the sea, and you will soon see that God is infinite and that supply is infinite. You need only think of the gold mines and silver mines and diamond mines and uranium mines and coal mines and begin to catch a tiny glimpse of how infinite supply is. So that there is no way at all of going to God for supply. For surely God is not withholding supply. Even in the countries where there is lack, such as we are finding today in India and China, it isn't because there's any lack of God's abundance, because men aren't planting it, aren't reaping it, aren't sowing it, aren't fertilizing, or aren't doing those things necessary to bring forth the crops. The land is there, and certainly the seeds of the crops have been there. They haven't been wasted, stolen, and so forth. So that there is really no place on the face of the earth where there is lack. In India, where you read of all this terrible starvation today, if you could only know the gems and the jewels and the gold and the assets of that continent, or in Africa, if you could know the extent of the wealth that is in Africa, in every tangible form, you would know that supply is infinite. Then how foolish to go to God for supply. Now, if we individually aren't demonstrating supply, it is not because we don't go to church. It is not because we don't attend the right church, it isn't because we weren't communed or confirmed or baptized. The world is still full of supply, whether or not we've done these things. The answer lies in the fact that we have not known the truth. Now, when a person first learns the truth that the demonstration of supply always starts with one passage of Scripture, we begin to understand our failure to demonstrate supply. What have you in the house? What have you in your house? Now just think. We should have realized this ages ago, that since God is infinite, and since the promise is, Son, all that I have is thine, and that God has given man dominion, it must necessarily follow that man has dominion over supply and that man has an infinity of supply. And so the demonstration of supply is dependent not on how much we receive, but how much we give out, because our storehouse is already full. God is individual consciousness. God is the source of supply, therefore individual consciousness is the source of supply. It isn't barren. It isn't an empty storehouse. Actually, God constitutes individual consciousness. Therefore, individual being is as infinite in substance and supply as God. All that I have is thine. Now, when we accept that, I and my Father are one, not two. I and my Father are one. Therefore, it is in this oneness that I have infinite supply. Now, to demonstrate that, I have to start giving it, pouring it, sharing it. And I have to do it at every level of life. On the material level, if I have a few drops of oil and a little meal, then I have to begin sharing it, giving the first fruits to God, giving the first fruits. But the giving and sharing of material possessions is, of course, one of the easiest of the demonstrations. But since God is spirit, the major part of our demonstration is really at the spiritual level. And that embraces going within ourselves and forgiving, sharing, serving, surrendering, giving up those qualities that act as a barrier to the divine, recognizing the spiritual nature of all mankind, of all. And in every possible way, pouring it out from within ourselves. Now, there hasn't been anybody in the history of the world who has learned this that has known lack or limitation, because even in a circumstance like Moses with the Hebrew people, where there couldn't conceivably be the supply of food or drink, he brings it forth in what seems to be miraculous ways, even with the Master in the wilderness, where there wasn't an abundance that was brought forth, if necessary, miraculously, or Rickenbacker out in the Pacific Ocean, where there certainly was no water or fresh water and certainly no food, and yet they had water and they had food. So that it would be impossible to be anywhere where supply is not, because it would be impossible to be any place where God is not. Now just think that the demonstration of supply is based on one truth, and that is that God or Spirit is supply. Now how much supply have we? God is the bread and the meat and the wine and the water. So how much bread, meat, wine, and water do we have? God is the fortress and the high tower. How much protection and safety and security do we have? But in our materialistic sense of life, we say that a bomb-proof shelter is security, and we say that money is supply. Thereby cut ourselves off from the infinity of supply that is at hand, and which will manifest itself in the necessary forms. The moment that we believe that supply is some of its manifested forms, like coal or oil or gold or silver or diamonds or bread or meat, if we think of that as supply, we've cut ourselves off from supply. But it doesn't mean that there's any lack of supply. It's still infinite and it's still omnipresent. There we go back to one of our favorite words, omnipresence. What does omnipresence mean? The omnipresence of God, the omnipresence of Spirit, the omnipresence of allness, the omnipresence of life, the omnipresence of truth, of love, of substance. So therefore, the omnipresence of supply. But we acknowledge omnipresence in one breath and deny it in the next. But the secret of supply is acknowledging the omnipresence. Since I and the Father are one, in that oneness there is the omnipresence of Spirit, and Spirit is the substance of all form. Therefore, having the substance of all form, the form must, of course, appear. And our proving of that is not in looking to receive it. That's what cuts us off from it. It is in seeking out the ways to express it. Of course, we may come to the end of our rope and believe we have nothing left. But that can't be true, because omnipresence is still there. The presence of God is still there. The presence of the bread of life is still there, the wine, the water. So no matter how barren we become, we still are filled. And it means we have to search deeper until we find what it is that we have in our house that we are keeping dammed up. Now, supposing we learn this lesson, and supposing we begin on some particular day and say, well, I will set aside so and so much percentage out of everything that comes in and give the first fruits to God and share the rest with my neighbor in accordance with love thy neighbor as thyself. And we get that part of it out of the way. And then we search around and say, yes, but what measure of unforgiveness is locked up in me? And search around until we've got that all completed. And search around for some service that we either owe to another, or even if we don't owe it, it would be loving to give it, share it. And keep on searching within our consciousness. As long as there appears to be a lack. Because the only lack is in drawing it up out of our consciousness. The lack is not external to us. Now supposing we learn that lesson, we put this into practice, and all of a sudden the abundance begins to flow. Do you not see that it never had been withheld because of God, but because of our ignorance of truth? God wasn't withholding it, and it didn't come to us because we did something to earn it or deserve it or be worthy of it. All we did now was come into the awareness of the truth that I already have it in the house. Well, the same thing is true in healing of any situation of human experience, whether it's a physical, mental, moral, financial, political, human relationships, whatever the healing may be. It is not because God all of a sudden deigns to do something, nor is it because we all of a sudden have contacted God. It has to do with the fact that we have discovered the truth, and it is the truth that makes us free. That is why very often when there is lack of healing, the only reason for it is an undiscovered truth. And in the case of those who are not very far along on the path, the greater responsibilities with the practitioner. Those who are further along the path, there is a responsibility on them to look within and see whether they are fulfilling the teaching that they're supposed to be living by. Because they can't go on forever benefiting by the grace of the practitioner's consciousness and ignoring their own responsibility to the spiritual life. You see by this that there is a difficulty in training ourselves to come to that place where we understand that it isn't something I do or left undone that all of a sudden releases God's good in my experience. It is something that I discover within myself that I have left undone or have erroneously done. It has not affected God to withholding anything from me. It has affected me to set up the barrier. God is the same, always. But the miracle is that God is omnipresence, that there is no way to get outside of the realm of God, not even through sin. But we can shut ourselves off from God's grace by sin, by ignorance of truth. But we can't shut God off from us. We shut ourselves off from God, and that's the big lesson to be learned. The availability of God is always the same, even in hell, even in the valley of the shadow of death. The availability of God is the same. It takes an act of awareness on our part. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And so it is, that as you know the truth about supply and begin to fulfill the laws of supply, you have an abundance of it. As you begin to understand the laws of health and fulfill those laws, you have an abundance of it. Why? Nobody's withholding it from us but ourselves. And the knowing of the truth sets us free. And that brings up an interesting point. We are trained humanly to rest to be satisfied in human harmony. We are completely at rest when we have a sense of health. Doesn't make any difference. The body may be diseased, but as long as we don't know it, and as long as it isn't paining us, we are accustomed to being at peace. So it is a person who has a position with a fairly good income is accustomed to feeling at peace. The fact that unemployment may be right around the corner for one reason or another isn't disturbing him at the moment, because at this moment everything outwardly appears to be all right. So it is that over the centuries we have developed a nature that makes it possible for us to feel at peace as long as the body isn't paining and as long as the pocketbook isn't straining. But when you come to a spiritual teaching, there is a need to make a transition in consciousness to where you realize that neither supply nor health are in the body or the pocketbook. Health isn't in the body, and supply isn't in the pocketbook or the bank account. That both of these are activities of consciousness and must be found in consciousness. In other words, there is a spiritual source of health and supply which we have to contact, which we have to know the truth of. And so it is that the dangerous place for every person on this path is the place where things are going beautifully. That's the most dangerous part of our lives, because they may be going beautifully as a result of all of our work, but we may have brought them only up to the sense of physical health or supply, and not made that transition which everyone must make. Your righteousness must be greater than the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. How much righteousness is that? They are already perfect humans. And so, the greater righteousness is where we have realized, well, why callest thou me good? There is but one good, the Father in heaven. Or, there is but one health. God is the health of my countenance. That's quite different than saying my heart beats all right and my lungs move all right and so forth and so on. Here is a transition from where we're not resting in a healthy body, but where we're making a conscious transition to the demonstration of spiritual harmony. Now, nobody can describe this because it's something you find in your consciousness. It's something that comes to you with the realization, for instance, that germs are not power, that weather isn't power, climate isn't power. When you have come to a degree of realization of these, not just reading about them in the books, but the degree of realization, why certainly, the I of me is power, the omnipresence of God is power, therefore God is not in the whirlwind. Power is not in the whirlwind. Power is not out there in germs. Power is not out there in weather or climate. Supply is not out there in dollars or mines. Of course not. Of course not. God is the health of my countenance. God is my supply. God is my safety and security. You know, something happens inside when you realize that physical protection is relatively unimportant. There are loads of people with lots of physical protection that find it doesn't stand up for them. I live and move and have my being in God. But that's not an affirmation. That's a truth. I'm hid with Christ in God. This is not an affirmation or a cliche. This is a truth. But it can't become true until I have some definite realization of it. I have to have a moment of click. I have to have a moment of realization that God alone governs my life, and that I am not affected by the external. I shall not fear what the mortal scene can do to me, mortal man, mortal mind, or mortal condition. Why? Because I and the Father are one. But this is something more than a statement. This is a realization. It is for this reason that in our meditations we should always take some subject, some specific subject for pondering, for contemplative meditation, and see if eventually we may have to meditate a dozen times on the same subject. Take supply, take health, take safety, security, peace, and work with them in contemplative meditation until something from within responds, and you say, whereas before I was blind, now I see it. Now I know, now I feel, now I'm aware. God is supply, or God is my health. There's not God and health. God can't give health and God can't send health. And God isn't the medium of health. God is health. And so when that becomes a living fire inside, then health is not dependent on the external realm. In the same way, if we realize that I am the bread, the meat, the wine, and the water, I am these, then I can't look outside here for supply to come. I just seek to open out a way to express more supply. But it has to become a conviction. It has to be a realized truth. And so it is, you'll find that our good is not dependent on God doing something. It's dependent on our knowing the truth that God is that something. God is the health of my countenance. God is supply. God is the fortress. God is the high tower. And then take that back to omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience. And then you have the whole secret of it, that really our good is an activity of our consciously realized truth. Our good is an activity of our consciously realized truth. And the moment we realize consciously the truth of supply, the truth of health, the truth of relationships, the truth of peace on earth, whatever it is, that's what we demonstrate. It was there always because of omnipresence. But now we know the truth. We are consciously aware of the truth. That brings us to this too, that the act of looking for anything in the future cuts us off from supply or health or whatever it is. Looking to the future is a barrier that separates us from our good. Because God can't exist in the future. God is omnipresence. And that omnipresence is only now. Whatever truth is truth now. There's no future about it, there's no past about it, because nothing exists except at the standpoint of now. For instance, if there are no coconuts on the trees over there, it doesn't indicate an absence of God. It doesn't indicate a barrenness of the tree. It probably indicates just the season. And if we could see inside of the tree, we'd know that God is functioning in the omnipresence of now. And as long as we abide in that truth, the coconuts will come forth in due season. Wherever there are peach trees today, or pear trees, wherever there is watermelon growing, if you could look in on it this February day, it would testify only to barrenness. Then we could say, look how absent God is. But no, omnipresence reveals to us that the processes of nature are taking place right now. Right now. They're not taking place in the future. And if those processes aren't taking place now, there'll be no fruitage in the future. It has to be in the now that omnipresence is functioning. Therefore, regardless of any sense of barrenness at this particular moment, in any direction, we have to be willing to look with our inner eye and behold that omnipresence is functioning now. And as long as omnipresence is functioning now, and omnipresence is omnipotence, and omnipotence is omniscience, as long as these are operating now, then in due season everything will appear in accordance with its natural operation. We judge by appearances, and judging by appearances, we declare the absence of God, the absence of good, the absence of spirit. But there is no such thing as an absence. There is only omnipresence, and omnipresence is functioning now. But if you do not realize omnipresence, remember, you're going to have no fruitage tomorrow, or next week, or next month, because the fruitage of next week, next month, and next year is dependent on your knowing the truth. And the only truth there is omnipresence. So in spite of any immediate barrenness, if you want fruit in due season, declare for your omnipresence as of this moment. And your omnipresence then may plant a seed, or it may operate on a seed that's already planted, or it may send the shoot up above the earth. But be assured of this: nothing is going to happen in the future except by reason of your realization of omnipresence now. The whole meaning of as ye sow, so shall ye reap, the whole meaning of karma, is that the thought and deed that you put in operation at this moment must come back to you. Now you can't get away from the law of as ye sow, so shall ye reap. You can't get away from your karma because you're creating it. If you are sowing in this moment to the flesh, that is, if you are declaring for non-omnipresence, if you are bemoaning your fate, if you are doing anything in the world except relaxing in omnipresence, omnipotence, and omniscience, All you're doing is sowing a lack for next week, next month, next year, or 5 years from now. Because the lack that you experience in this moment is a lack that's going to come back and plague you in its due season. If you sow to the Spirit truth, you reap life everlasting. But you have to do your sowing now. Now, if you now realize omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, if you now realize I and the Father are one, and all that the Father hath is mine, if you realize now that Spirit is the only life and the only law, do you not see that you are sowing to the Spirit, to truth, and that your demonstration will be life everlasting, harmonious, and abundant? You are sowing your crops with every breath you breathe. And that which we are sowing is that which comes back and which we later reap. Now, God isn't going to do anything in the future, but your realization of the omnipresence of God is the assurance that your good is embodied here and now, and then all it has to do is crop out into visibility. And that may be a now, which we'd call tomorrow, next month, or next year. That is covered in our work by what I say about looking out from life as of this moment. Looking out at life from the center of your being. Always come back to the center of your being and realize your oneness with the divine. Bring your life to the central point of this instant, and understand that it is in this instant that your relationship with God is established, is operative, is functioning, is bearing fruit. Always come back to this instant. Break the habit of living in the past and break the habit of living in the future. Certain plans for the future are necessary, but these are always tentative because they're always based on the will of God. But make the major function of life coming back to the center and realizing here and now I and the Father are one, and that is why here and now there is omnipresence. The omnipresence of infinity, the omnipresence of infinite abundance, the omnipresence of life eternal, the omnipresence of omnipotence. And watch this. Watch it in yourself, and you'll see it later in others. That people live in a squirrel cage. All mankind lives in a squirrel cage. It's their own mind. And their mind is just a squirrel cage. And that's all it is. They don't live outside the confines of that mind. They don't know what's going on in the world. They don't know what's going on in the life of men or women or anything. They live only in the embodiment of their own mind, and they race around in there from one thing to another, like a squirrel chasing nuts. And that's where the majority of lives are confined. right inside that squirrel cage, round and round, and they don't even have a brass ring in there like they do on a merry-go-round. Now, you can break that if you still feel that you're confined to a squirrel cage, because actually no one has a right to be living inside of their own mind. It's all right to live inside of your soul, because then you're living in the lives of everybody on earth, because it is only one soul. But when you're living within the confines of that tied-up mind, you're living only to self, and you're not living out from the center of your being. You break that by coming back to your own center and realizing that here I and the Father are one. And my oneness with God constitutes my oneness with all spiritual being and idea, with all of God's children, with all of God's ideas. I am not confined to this body. I am not confined to this mind. I am living the life of infinite being. I am not circumscribed within the limitations of the cradle to the grave. All you have to do is remember the parenthesis in eternity, and then try to push those bars back. Don't be so confined in that parenthesis, and more especially not in the parenthesis of your personal life. Have a broader outlook, and you bring yourself to this not by becoming more worldly, but by realizing your oneness with God and your oneness with all spiritual being, even the spiritual being that calls itself past, present, or future, because you're living infinite being, uncircumscribed being. Then, when you're in meditation and you have the listening ear, you can bring to yourself the wealth of truth from the entire world, not just a limited aspect of it. Well, I suppose that would bring us to this. That our life is lived in consciousness rather than in the forms that consciousness assumes. Our life is lived in infinite consciousness within, and we're to turn within to our consciousness and bring forth harmony, peace, justice, benevolence, truth, life, and love. Always we're to bring it forth from within our consciousness, not to look to man whose breath is in his nostril for it, not to look to circumstances or conditions for it, but to learn to live so that every day we turn within to see what joys, what glories we're going to bring forth from within our own consciousness. This breaks that pattern of the squirrel cage, because when we turn to our consciousness, we're turning to infinity, and we're bringing forth experiences, some of which have never been recorded by man, and others of which have only been recorded by those who have had the deepest of spiritual vision. It's like saying man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Then how necessary it is to turn within for that bread of life. How necessary it is to turn within several times a day for that bread of life, and gradually find that we're not living the life of a squirrel chasing a nut. So then, God is always functioning. And God is always functioning at the standpoint of omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience. And the remedy for our ills is not concerning ourselves about God, but about this turning away from living in the outer realm and living as an activity of consciousness, and through an activity and by an activity of consciousness, and always turning within to that consciousness for the fruits of the Spirit: harmony, peace of all kinds, good in every form, but turn within and expect it as an activity of truth in our consciousness rather than as some external experience or as some favor from God, which it can't be. Not a favor in the sense that God is doing us a favor, because God is no respecter of persons. God's grace, God's reign falls on the just and the unjust. It's omnipresence. It's available to us through seeking it in our consciousness rather than in its manifested forms. Thank you.